Thank you, Gandhis, for tracking me down and inviting me here. And thank you all for turning up on this pretty miserable night. Since I published my book in, I think it's the end of September, I've been doing a lot of sort of interviews about it, some of which you might have seen, but almost all of them have been done through a laptop, which is a very alienating experience. A bit closer? Is that any good? Yeah. And it is really, really nice to come out and be in a big room of people like this. It makes such a difference being able to have a kind of a social interaction. So thank you for inviting me at this time.
Thank you for coming. Just sorting out.
Yeah. Is that okay? Okay. The strange title of my book is The Road to Fascism. And it's got a subtitle which is For a Critique of the Global Biosecurity State. Fascism is a very loaded term, isn't it? When I started writing about what I called the UK biosecurity state, or the Great Reset, or the coronavirus crisis, and all these names that it's gone through, I really resisted using that term. It was the last term that I used. From the very start, I started calling it the biosecurity state, and I'm going to be talking about what I mean by that term. And fairly early on, I think, certainly by the end of 2020, I was talking about it in terms of a totalitarian form of governance which was being implemented. But I resisted using this word fascism. As I said, it's a loaded term, and my generation, I kind of mentioned this in the book, I grew up with things like The Young Ones on TV, when Rick used to call everyone he didn't like a fascist. And it's still used in these terms, isn't it? If you don't like someone, particularly on the left, anyone they don't like is a fascist straight away. So I didn't want to use it because if you use that term, you kind of identify yourself as not serious, not worthy of being taken seriously. But when I started to write this book, it has been preceded by 18 months I published about 24 articles. Most of them were analysis of the kind of statistics, the data and the figures that were being published by the Office for National Statistics, the NHS, and so on and so forth, and the analysis of the policy, that is the regulations, the coronavirus justified regulations, that were being enforced on us on the justification of the statistics. So they were mostly analytical. You probably know, you may not know, that over that 2-year period, 582 coronavirus justified regulations were made into law in this country. And the vast majority of them were made outside of any democratic process. They weren't presented to Parliament in advance for scrutiny or approval even, and they weren't accompanied by any data justifying them or saying that they were proportional. But towards the end of 2020, I began to sort of try and think about where is this all going? What is the point of this? I understand that these manufactured crises, this crisis which didn't exist, it didn't exist as a threat to the public health of the nation, which every regulation stated. What was it being done in aid of? As I said, I resisted using this word fascism. It's the last word I use. But then the winter of 2020-21 came down. And during that period, I watched, as most of us did, in horror about what was going on in Lithuania, in Austria, in Germany, in Canada, in particular, in Australia, in New Zealand. Not so much here, but still for those of us who went on those marches in the spring, the enormous increase in police violence, state-sanctioned violence against us. And I thought to myself, well, if this isn't fascism, what is it? And then I decided to write my book. And right at the beginning, I came up with this title, The Road to Fascism. It's a quotation of a very famous book by Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, who's sort of one of the grandfathers, if you like, of neoliberal capitalism, this kind of theory of which has dominated our politics and our economics since the 1970s. And his book is called The Road to Serfdom. And his argument, which I don't share, but it's an argument about the threat to individual liberty that comes from state power. In particular, when governments justify their actions by something they call the common good, how that takes away from individual liberties. So that seemed to me, even though I don't agree with a lot of his premises, it seemed to me a warning that it echoes louder now than it did then. When Hayek published his book in 1944, I think it was, towards the end of the Second World War, 35 million Europeans had lived under some form of fascism for a decade or more. In the case of Italians, for almost 2 decades. 2 decades, yeah. Nowadays, there's, gosh, I've forgotten my figures now, but it's something like close to 100 million people living in the West, that is Europe, North America, and Australasia, who've been living, certainly during that winter, under something very close to fascism, I thought, in terms of the state and what it was doing. So, when I started to write the book, I thought, there's always one, isn't there? Oh, it's not you. That's okay. When I started off, I thought I didn't have an answer to the question, are we living under a form of fascism? Has there been a return of fascism to the West? I literally didn't have an answer, and I started writing this and publishing the individual chapters online on my website, and they were fairly well read. So I didn't start off with thinking, okay, we're living under this, I'm going to prove it. It was an investigation, but it began in those very, very, very dark days of the winter of 21-22 that we've gone back, and I don't think any of us think are over. I think they're threatening to come back. Sorry, a bit closer. So the term fascism was an investigation. I wanted to put it forward because as soon as I started mentioning it, people said, no, this isn't fascism. Fascism's over. Fascism is in the past. Or, you don't understand what fascism is. Fascism is this, that, and the other. My book is not an academic exercise. There are literally thousands of books written about fascism. And they usually say, well, this is what my definition of fascism is. Let's see if this is an example of it. Or they look at the history of historical fascism between the 20s and 30s, and they come to some sort of definition of what it is. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is to say, what can the history of fascism, historical fascism, that period in the 20s and 30s in Europe, tell us about this moment now? So, I was thinking about how am I going to talk about my entire book in this discussion. It's a real privilege to have a sort of an hour or 45 minutes to talk to you. And I want to use it wisely. And I thought, I'm not going to just go through and summarize my book. I want to look at this question of nomenclature, of definitions of words and what they mean. Because my book is about saying, I think this is fascism. So, and I want to start off by saying there are 3 reasons to do this, to try and name what we're talking about. One of them is, and this is one of the primary ones when using a word like fascism, is it's a warning about what we're facing. When I started writing this, very quickly, I started writing in February. In March, in this country and across the West, the 582 coronavirus-justified regulations and the thousands of restrictions that it imposed on our freedoms and our human rights were generally lifted. They're not all lifted. The NHS is still imposing masks. Individual private companies are still requiring their employees to be injected, etc., etc. You can't get on an airplane sometimes without masks and so on and so forth. So they're not completely gone, but the regulations themselves have been revoked. And I think, it's justifiable. A lot of us were like, oh God, thank goodness, that's over. I didn't think that. Did anyone in this room think that? But a lot of people did think that, didn't they? It was like, that's in the past. So now let's get on. Even those of us who were, I'll stop saying us, but a lot of people who've been opposed to lockdown, had been opposed to vaccine mandates. I can't keep doing that, but every time I use the word vaccine, I'm also having question marks, because we all know that they're not vaccines, they're injections. But vaccine mandates, mandates on masking and so on, even those who've been opposed to it, there was a kind of a relief that this was over, and their energies went towards 2 things generally. One was to question the justification for lockdown and to try and hold the government to account for it. And also, which I think is still very, very valuable, to challenge the continuation of the UK vaccination programme, and particularly its extension to children, but to everyone as well. But I think, again, understandably, there was a reluctance to look at what is coming next. I don't believe, and I think since you're here, you don't believe either, that 2 years of terror, which is what it was not preparing something else. And one of the reasons I'm using the word fascism, because I want to issue a warning about the seriousness of what is about to happen. I believe that those 2 years of terror have been a platform for something else. And in a way, what we've been going through since March is a kind of, again, a historical reference, a phony war. If you remember, when war was declared in September 19th, August, September, gosh, I've got my history, haven't I? September 1939, wasn't it? Hostilities between France and Germany and the rest of Europe didn't start until well into 1940. It was actually a kind of an 8-month period, I think, which is, strangely enough, almost exactly what we're on now. We've been going through a kind of a phony war. Everyone's gone back into a kind of a sense of security. But, so the first thing about using the term fascism is a warning of what is coming. The second one is to correct what I think are misrepresentations of what is happening. Right from the beginning, how can I call them? The enemies of freedom, I don't want to give them any political term because I think they are the enemies of freedom, have been very adept at discrediting anyone who challenges or questions what's going on, or even asks a question about what's coming on. By calling them conspiracy theorists or right-wing conspiracy theorists and so on. I think it's very interesting that usually in this country, if you want to discredit anyone who challenges anything the government does, you usually call them the loony left. In the US, you call them commies, goddamn commies, or something like that. But it's generally dismissed as the left, because it's generally the left that holds the government to account to a certain extent. Particularly in this country because usually we have a conservative government. And the left traditionally, at least identifies itself as being a political group which is concerned about defending human rights and so on and so forth. But right from the beginning here, anyone who questioned what the government was doing, which is after all was a conservative government, was called a right-wing conspiracy theorist. And one of the effects with that, it brought almost the entire left in this country, not just the Labour Party, but other left-wing groups, into compliance and collaboration with what the government was doing. The other thing that's happened is most of the opposition in this country and across the West to lockdown, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, the construction of the biosecurity state has come from a kind of a libertarian position, which you might call right-wing. One of the things maybe we can talk about is how little these terms, left and right, have any purchase on the political paradigm of the global biosecurity state. But I'm going to use them in the conventional sort of terms. And one of the... Sorry, let me just have a drink because I'm getting a bit dry mouth. One of the effects of that is that a lot of people on the libertarian right, so-called, have described what is happening as some form of communist coup. Yeah? You've heard that, haven't you? I think that comes from the equation of the left with an authoritarian state, and the larger the power of the state gets, the more it's equated with the left, whereas the diminution of the state, the dismantling of the state, is equated with the right. Again, I completely disagree with that as a description. The most powerful state I think there's ever been in history is the state of the USA, which kind of dominates the globe, and which is clearly not communist. So I think it's very important, I've kind of argued this with a lot of people, that no, what is happening here is not a communist coup, it's a fascist coup, it's a globalist coup. And the model of the state it's imposing in us is not a communist one, it's a fascist one. You might argue that you don't see much difference between them. But the point is, even though it's quite clear that the People's Republic of China has offered a very strong model of, after all, lockdown, they were the first country to lock down, of a system of social credit, if we want to understand how that gets translated into a European and a Western context, because we've got very different economies, very different ideologies, what we're describing is fascism, not communism. The third thing is, of course, the third reason to use this term fascism, and to clarify what that means, is because the more we understand what we're facing, the more we are not confused or distracted by these inaccurate descriptions of what is going on, the better we are equipped to resist it, and to fight it, and to overturn it. I think describing Klaus Schwab, the director of the World Economic Forum, or the president of the European Commission, or the prime ministers and presidents of the G7 nations, or the head of the World Health Organization, or the head of the Bank of International Settlements, or the head of the World Bank, or all these organizations which dominate the West as communists, is ludicrous. But it's more important than ludicrous. It's not only inaccurate, it distracts us from a real analysis of actually what is going on, one which situates it within the conditions of Western capitalism at the moment. The first thing I argue in my book is what we are going through at the moment is a revolution in Western capitalism. This is something that's happening to the West primarily. The rest of the world is far less influenced or impacted by this. So, 3 reasons for using this terminology. 1 is as a warning of the seriousness of what's coming. 2 is to not allow it to be taken out of our grasp, to be inaccurately described. And 3, to understand it better. I think this is a very interesting moment to be meeting, because there is a kind of a tidal change at the moment. As the impact of this terrible program of vaccination, and God knows what it's done to the world, is becoming more and more apparent, the data and the figures and the impact of that, the confessions, if you like, the extracted confessions from organizations like Pfizer, that their vaccination never did anything to stop transmission, and therefore the entire imposition of vaccine passports, as they're so-called, had absolutely no basis at all. As the extent of the lies by which we were ruled for 2 years become more and more apparent, still not in our mainstream papers, but more and more online, more and more people are realizing what exactly happened. And therefore there is more and more of a desire to understand to what end, where is it going. I guess that's what I want to talk about. Okay. So, there are 3 terms which I'm going to try and elucidate in my book, which I use to describe what is going on. The first one is fascism. The second one is biosecurity. It's in the title of my book. And the third one is totalitarianism. And these are the 3 terms that I use to describe what is happening now and this brave new world that we're being ushered into against our will, and with pretty much any consultation about whether we want to go into it or not. I was very struck that right at the beginning of lockdown, we were told by everyone that what we were facing was an unprecedented situation and requiring unprecedented measures, for which, by implication, the people imposing them didn't hold any responsibility, were not accountable for the impacts they had. And the effect of that is, I think this week Chris Whitty, our chief medical officer, said one of the reasons we're having a vast increase in overall morality. Morality. That's a joke, isn't it? Decrease in morality. An increase in overall mortality across Europe, far greater than we did during the so-called pandemic, is precisely because of the withdrawal of medical treatment, diagnosis, and care for 2 years under lockdown. So who would have thought of that? I thought of it, I wrote about it, I analysed it, and so did a lot of other people. And yet our chief medical officer is telling us now as if, it's just occurred to him. So I was very suspicious that this term, unprecedented, was used right from the very start. I'm trained as an art historian, and the period that I studied was, unsurprisingly, the 20s and 30s, exactly this period during fascism. And I when this all kind of rolled into gear, when they started declaring that we were in a state of emergency, most of Europe declared they were in a state of emergency. In this country we did it slightly different. We didn't enact the, the Civil Contingencies Act. We did it all under the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. But we went into an emergency period. And during this emergency period, every piece of legislation that took away our rights and took away our freedoms was justified as we are in a state of emergency, effectively, in an emergency period under an imminent and serious threat to public health. That's what every regulation says. And I thought, this isn't unprecedented. This has been done before. You may know that the Third Reich, when it came into power in 1933, declared a state of emergency. And under that state of emergency, it imposed regulations and restrictions and removals of the human rights of the German people, which are very similar to those which were used in the last 2 years under lockdown. And that state of emergency wasn't lifted until the Third Reich was defeated. Fascist states, fascist governments, always operate under states of emergency. And so the first thing I thought was, this is not unprecedented. The UK itself has quite regularly been under a state of emergency. During the 70s, with the kind of the miners' strikes, the industrial strikes, we were constantly put under states of emergency. In France, Emmanuel Macron, who's a nasty little fascist if ever I see one, has repeatedly put the country in a state of emergency to deal with the Gilets jaunes protests and so on and so forth. So there was nothing unprecedented about that. The other thing I didn't think which is unprecedented was, what I'll go on to talk about, was the biosecurity horizon or dimension of the laws that were being imposed against us. So, I want to talk about, I can't go through the whole book, but I want to talk about 3 aspects of what has been happening, what has happened to us, what has been done to us, which are not unprecedented and actually draw their paradigm from fascism. Sorry, I seem to be extraordinarily thirsty at the moment. Thank you. Now, the first of those is the rise of a global form of governance, which is happening right now. I think, again, Monsieur Macron just the other week made a statement in which he talked quite openly about forming a global government. Our old friend Klaus Schwab has been saying this for a very, very long time, and more governments are coming out about it. The G20, they had their meeting recently in, where was it, Bali, I think it was, wasn't it? And they came out of that and talked quite openly about this new paradigm of global governance. They've got all sorts of justifications for it, haven't they? One of them is we have to combat global warming. One of it is because we have to defeat Russia. Sometimes it's because of, I don't know, strange bias, what were threats to our security. Okay. The point is, after the Second World War, the West created a whole series of institutions of global governance. The United Nations, the European Union, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, later on the World Economic Forum. There's dozens of them. And they were initially created precisely to ensure that fascism would never return to Europe. Because the idea was that if you had European nations under a single, not quite yet a form of governance, that the kind of internecine fighting, combating, struggle for supremacy between European nations, which had created 2 world wars after all, could not happen again. And they're right, it hasn't happened again. The war that's being fought now is not a war of nations against other nations. It's a war of governments against the people they govern. It's a civil war, I think, in a way. How does that affect us? How does this form of global governance affect us? I'll give you a few examples. One of them is the pandemic treaty. It's got a long term, isn't it? Pandemic preparedness, response, blah, blah, blah. It seems to go on and on. But it's a pandemic treaty. It's been formulated by the World Health Organization, which, let me remind you, is a private organization, largely funded by the Bill and Gates Foundation, but also by the G7, all the nations that contribute to it. But the Bill and Melinda Gates is one of the biggest funders of it. It's a private organization. It's got absolutely no mandate over us in any kind of law. And yet it has formulated a treaty which will allow it to decide about the reimposition of vaccine mandates, or mask mandates, or even of lockdown. Now, the WHO, the World Health Organization, it doesn't have an army yet. and it doesn't have a police force. So we can't actually enforce these. But what it allows to do is something which I think is very interesting. It allows, for instance, the UK and our government, or our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to say, well, the WHO has advised that vaccine mandates should be reimposed on the population of the UK for the safety of the people in the state. And Rishi Sunak, or the government, will then be able to say, well, this is not a political decision. This is a technical decision. It's a medical decision. And we're simply going to impose it. And the UK government does have a police force and an army. So what becomes a piece of advice from a private technocratic organisation then becomes government policy and police enforcement. What this is setting up, what this has set up, which actually exists now, is a technocratic form of governance, which operates outside of any democratic process. It completely bypasses the fundamental division on which democracy is founded, in principle at least, maybe not in practice, which is the division between the executive, the government, the legislature, the parliament, and the judiciary. When you don't need a judiciary, you don't need a parliament, and you don't need a government, when you have technocratic advisors imposing policy on the population of a member state. There are 194 countries, which is basically the whole world, signed up, or potentially signing up. They're members of the World Health Organization. So that's one of the things that's happening right now. We should also remember that the manufacture of the so-called coronavirus crisis was done under the authority of the World Health Organization. In, I think it was March the 11th when they actually declared it, the World Health Organization. Two things happened on that day. The World Health Organization, ignoring every criteria it had ever used before of what constitutes a pandemic. I think the number of people who had actually died, even officially, of COVID-19, or deaths have been attributed to COVID-19, numbered in, as a handful by then, declared a global pandemic. And at the same time, the World Economic Forum created the basis to its stakeholder capitalism, which is another form of technocratic governance. Okay, so fascism, historical fascism, was very much a kind of a nationalist kind of movement. But you have to remember the Third Reich and the Italian fascism, they certainly had imperialist intentions. It wasn't limited to the country. They wanted to conquer Europe, conquer the world. That's not the way the world works now. The geopolitics of Europe is very different. But like fascism, it's setting up a technocratic form of governance which is not only bypassing our democracy, it's actually dismantling the institutions of democracy. And I think that's something in which we can learn and be warned about, that was done by fascism and it's happening again now. What happens when you dismantle the institutions of our democracy is you're then able to remove human rights. And one of the ways, the primary way that our human rights were and are still being removed by the biosecurity state, that is the individual biosecurity states like the UK, but also what I call the global biosecurity state, which is dominating the West now, is by saying, it's by privileging the state as the absolute authority over the population. What we've been told is that everything which was inscribed into human rights after the Second World War by the European Convention on Human Rights, which was then taken into UK legislation in 1998 under the Human Rights Act, could all be suspended on the justification that we were facing a threat to public health. And on that justification, everything that we thought was kind of at the heart of our democracy, rights which are described in all the legislation as universal, indivisible, and what's the other one? Inalienable. Those three words have proven to be completely meaningless as long as the government can say, well, they would be usually under different circumstances, but under these circumstances, your individual rights become subsumed to the common good. Now, this has set up a kind of a model of governance, which again is very close to what historical fascism did. There are a lot of different models of what the common good is at the moment, aren't there? It's not just about the threat of viral infection, of a pandemic, but also now of global warming. Global warming is the ultimate common good. We're told we're going to reduce, because the, what's it called, I put it in my book, I can't remember this, the international, what do they call, the IPCC, isn't it? It's another international technocracy which has said we need to reduce our carbon emissions, we need to reduce our energy consumption, we need to reduce our food consumption to a certain level, or the planet's going to die. So we've created this model of, under this model, where we can say this is a common good, and in the interests of meeting that common good, your individual human rights are worth nothing at all. The third element, I think, of the return of historical fascism to today is the return of the ideology of fascism. It's come under a different guise, but I think the dominant ideology of today is fascistic. One of the things I said earlier on about trying to understand what we're facing is to understand not simply its programs and its technologies, these new programs and technologies which are being enforced on us, like digital ID or artificial intelligence. It's also understanding the ideologies themselves. I think at the moment, the emergent ideology of the global biosecurity state is woke. I don't think woke is a joke in a way. People sort of say, they dismiss it as something which is, it's about young people. Some people think it's a good thing, blah, 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 blah. I remember when Justin Trudeau was preparing the Canadian public to agree with him suspending Parliament, evoking emergency powers, and sending in extremely aggressive police and paramilitary forces to crush the protests against vaccine mandates in Ottawa and across Canada. And you probably remember that he kind of used every insult in the woke handbook to attack these largely working class truckers and their families. And I remember that I was very struck by the counter demonstrations that came out, where you had these young, masked up, completely compliant youth, generally, coming out and holding up cardboard boards saying, check your privilege. And it seemed extraordinary to me that this is how, in a very short period, the language of woke, the ideology of woke, had gone from this sort of very marginal and quite ridiculous sort of field of discourse, if you like, and was suddenly being employed by the most powerful people in the world, used by presidents, by Emmanuel Macron, to justify inflicting all the power of the state against people who were, after all, standing up for their human rights. I was going to, so I don't just talk to you all the time, I was going to read out something I wrote about the woke, just to kind of break up the speech a bit. I've got an entire chapter which I write about. It's called the aesthetics of totalitarianism, and I think there's a lot of similarities between the aesthetics of fascism and the aesthetics of woke. We tend nowadays to associate fascism with kind of jackboots and Nazi salutes and stuff like that. But that actually is not what it was like. It was a very sentimental, saccharine kind of aesthetic, and I think it's returned in woke. I'll read this out just to sort of break up my talk. What the current revolution in the West, from neoliberalism into biosecurity, is demonstrating is that, far from being opposed to fascism, as it has depicted itself in the culture wars of the past 20 years, woke, with its cult of youth, its saccharine sentimentality, its suppression of memory and history, its embrace of mob rule, its kitsch aesthetics, its regression to cultural conservatism, its adherence to identity politics, its hatred of the working class, its politicization of race, its allegiance to the market as the only framework for change, its advocacy of surveillance technology, its collaboration with the police, its extolling of reform over revolution, its suppression of intellectual, cultural, and political debate, its normalization of censorship as the default response to disagreement, its culture of no platforming those who do not share its principles, its ban on books and authors that do not adhere to its ideology, its organized campaigns to socially ostracize and professionally ruin the non-compliant, the violence with which it demands allegiance to its orthodoxies, the adolescent puritanism of its sexual politics, its creation of ideological hegemony through indoctrination programs such as diversity training and unconscious bias training, its hierarchy of obedience established by public demonstrations of virtue, its almost universal adoption by our media, our police forces, our education institutions, our sporting and cultural institutions, its enforcement by repressive legislation, removing our rights and freedoms on the justification of protecting us from the heterogeneous elements of our society, and above all the ease with which it has been employed by national governments, private corporations, and the international technocracies they form to increase and expand their political, economic, and cultural power. Woke is not liberal, and it certainly isn't socialist. Woke is fascist. Thank you. I've been dying to say that for a long time. Is it beeping too much? Is it? Okay. Okay. Let me move on to... How much time have I got now? Let's have a look. 8:15. When did I start? 7:30. I've got 3 quarters of an hour. I better move up then. Okay. I've got an hour, and I've done 3/4, have I? Okay. I've been rambling a little bit, haven't I? Then.
No, not at all.
Because I want to. Okay. If I've only got a. Okay. Let me quickly go through the next two. So I've been talking a bit too long. The second term I want to use is this term biosecurity. Biosecurity is a very interesting term. It relates to biopower, the term biopower, which was a term which was introduced into philosophical discourse by the French philosopher Michel Foucault in the sort of 1970s, 1980s. For Foucault, biopower is different to the power of legal enforcement. Law says you can and cannot do this. If you do this, we will punish you, we'll imprison you, or we'll execute you, or whatever. Biopower is the way through which the modern state controls people's behavior. It's not merely an interdiction, it's not merely a negative thing, it's about changing the way that people behave. And it does so by controlling people's bodies. It surveys, regulates, monitors, and ultimately controls our bodies. And you don't mean to say that a lot of the new programs and technologies which are being imposed on us at the moment are trying to do exactly that. Digital identity, central bank digital currency, universal basic income, which people on the left still seem to think is something which is good, a system of social credit, which itself is monitored by facial recognition technology, by the Internet of Things and the Internet of Bodies. These are all technologies which monitor, regulate, and control our bodies outside of any reference to human rights. So I think the term biosecurity is very useful to understanding how these new technologies, these new programs, are going to fundamentally change the social contract we have with the state. Rishi Sunak, as soon as he was, how did he come to power? He certainly wasn't elected, wasn't he? He wasn't elected by he wasn't elected by the public. He wasn't even elected by his party. He was simply appointed, wasn't he? Which is another demonstration that we don't live in a democracy anymore. Well, I don't think we have since March 2020. But this is a very good demonstration of it. But as soon as he came in, he announced unilaterally that he, not even his party, was going to impose digital identity on us and central bank digital currency. And the G20 kind of ratified that at their last meeting. These technologies are being implemented on the justification that they are mere upgrades to the infrastructure of the state. But what they actually are going to do is move us into a completely different paradigm of governance, which is not going to be a democratic one. It's going to be a technocratic one, in which our bodies themselves are going to become the object of a biopolitical strategy. Maybe I'll talk about this a little bit more in the Q&As and maybe extrapolate on a little bit more. Let me move on to the third term. I wanted to say a lot more about that, but I've been waffling a bit. The third term I want to talk about is totalitarianism. Because the world that we're going to be moved into by these new programs, by central bank digital currency, unless we resist it, by digital identity, is a properly totalitarian one. One of the, I'm kind of rushing through this, but one of the best descriptions I've come across of what a totalitarian form of governance is that by the German political theorist Hannah Arendt, who you might have heard of, who herself was an escapee from the Third Reich, so she knew something about what living in a totalitarian system was like. In her book, which she published in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she talked about totalitarianism as a novel form of governance, a form of domination which hadn't been seen before. And she said they had four characteristics. The first one was that totalitarian governance is always done under the authority of a higher authority. We tend to think of totalitarianism as being under figures like Hitler or Stalin, of dominant leaders, and certainly that's how fascism tends to work. But she says totalitarianism is done differently. Totalitarian systems work to an unassailable, unquestionable higher authority. And we can see that being that repeated throughout these last 2 years, when every time people questioned anything, we were told to follow the science that way. And it's interesting that the same people who said to us every time we questioned whether there was a need for masking, did masking have any effect, or whether there was a need for a vaccination program, they told us, follow the science. Now that itself is a fundamentally unscientific statement. Science is not an apotheosized truth. It is quite the opposite of that. It's a form of investigation. It's a set of procedures for establishing truths. It's never an absolute one. As Giorgio Agamben says, the Italian philosopher, science has become the dominant religion of the West at the moment. But it's interesting that when the restrictions, the biosecurity restrictions, were lifted in this March, we had the return of the next crisis, which is the global warming crisis, the environmental crisis. And the people who came out said exactly the same things to us. Every time we said, well, there's not actually a complete consensus on the fact that the Earth is warming, or if it is, that it's been man-made, as it were. And they said to us, follow the science, don't question the science. Science has become this apotheosized religion which we're not allowed to question, and therefore fundamentally unscientific. This is the higher authority of a properly totalitarian society. I remember the other day seeing a video of, what's his name? He's that Tottenham MP, wasn't he? And he had his head in his hands because he was on some sort of... David Lammy, yes, who's someone I particularly don't like. And he had his head in his hands and he said, I can't believe that in 2022 people still don't believe this. And what he was saying is, you can't question this. You can't believe it. So this idea of a higher authority, which is unquestionable and from which everything can be justified, is it's a trademark, if you like, of a totalitarian society. The second characteristic of a totalitarian society is the rule of terror. But I don't need to go into this, but the last 2 years we've been living under the rule of terror, haven't we? And it's been relieved for a little while. But Hannah Arendt says the phases of totalitarianism, the real programs, this is the term she uses, of a totalitarian form of governance, of domination, only come after the initial reign of terror. And they're imposed when the people, the architects of this totalitarian system, believe that all resistance has been crushed. So it's very important that we show them that all resistance hasn't been crushed. But I think the next level of totalitarian dominance, of digital ID and central bank digital currency, they get the two most important ones, are going to be imposed not under lockdown, and not even under regulations. They're simply going to be rolled out without us consulting them. The third one, the one that I want to talk about most of all, if I've got a little time, I've got a few more minutes. I got loads of time?
Yeah, because we finished at 9:15, so we can have the Q&A at
Okay.
2.
Well, I'll try and run on. The third one she talks about is what she calls ideological thinking. Now, in the Marxist problematic, ideology simply constitutes the superstructure of a society. You have an economic infrastructure, and then you have a kind of a legal, cultural, and political superstructure. That's not the way that Arendt thinks about ideology. For her, ideological thinking is a way of deducing conclusions which bypass critical thinking. So it goes back to what I was saying before. Recently, you had a demonstration, a protest by Doctors for Extinction Rebellion, and they went up to. Like you can imagine Extinction Rebellion thought, well, doctors have now been kind of elevated to this sort of almost religious status of kind of priests of this higher authority of science. How can we use them to promote Agenda 2030 and everything that means? And they went up to the offices, the London offices of JP Morgan, a bank. You know who JP Morgan is, and they broke the windows. And they wrote on their website a series of deductions that began with the first premise: we are experiencing global warming, which is made by man, it's man-made global warming. And because of this, we are therefore, there's a series of deductions, this justifies this. It's a series of reasonings which goes, we are doctors and we are responsible. We've signed a kind of a Hippocratic oath that we are responsible for the safety of the health of our patients. Global warming constitutes a threat to the health of the people on the planet. JP Morgan is one of the primary funders of fossil fuels. Therefore, blah 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 blah. And you get to a point where doctors are breaking the windows of a bank in central London. And I thought, that sounds very familiar as a kind of a series of deductions. It starts from an unexamined premise which has been accepted as orthodoxy, and if you create an ideology in which ideological thinking goes through a series of deductions which require no critical thinking, which actually bypass critical thinking, you can justify almost anything. As we saw, the first premise that coronavirus constitutes a novel pandemic which threatens Western civilization, I think that was the terms they were using in March 2020, we can therefore impose lockdown. And the only way out of lockdown is to inject the entire population of the planet. Or we can lock kids in schools or lock kids out of schools, or we can put kids in masks for the rest of their life. Once you've got an unexamined first premise, ideological thinking allows you to deduce almost anything. And at the moment, what we're seeing is the architects of the architects of these global technocracies, this global governance which is being formed by these technocracies, are going to introduce digital ID, central bank digital currency, a form of social credit system very similar to that in China, and all the other technologies of our slavery, our imprisonment, on the justification of what? Protecting us from another pandemic, or global warming, or whatever. So this way of thinking, which goes contrary to everything that we grew up in, the very bases of Western democracies and Western thinking, of questioning, of criticizing, that there is no absolute truth, that we live in a secular society and religious truth is not the way that we operate, has been completely wiped away and replaced by this ideological form of thinking. Okay, I do want to end on something good. That is, how do we get off the road to fascism? If this is the road to fascism we're on, I haven't been particularly eloquent tonight. It's kind of weird trying to sum up a whole book. The book's a lot better written than I've spoken tonight. I hope you'll get it and read it. But I want to talk about because this is a life skills support group.
A boring name so that we don't get a spotlight upon us.
Yeah, and
Yes.
Cottage was very insistent that out of this we come up with some ways in which we can get off this road to fascism. So I'm going to go through some pretty basic ones. The first ones are through non-compliance. Should have gone to this straight away, shouldn't I? Yeah. And the good thing about non-compliance is you can do it individually. So let me just enumerate some of the ways in which you can be non-compliant. You can never ever social distance. You can never ever wear a mask. You can never engage in any form of contact tracing, handing your details over to people for the right to enter into their premises. You can stop using smartphones. We know what there are, they're tracking devices. Get yourself one of these, yeah? Or a fob watch. Get a fob watch. Learn to use an A to Z, yeah. Stop using smartphones. We've known what they are for a very long time, and now it's coming true what they are. If the whole of the population doesn't have a smartphone, this ends. Yep, get rid of your smartphone. Never, ever, ever get tested with a PCR test or any other form of test. Obviously, never get injected with the poison that they're putting into other people's veins. Yeah. Never carry a vaccine passport of any form. If that means you can't go on holiday, the British Isles are a very, very beautiful place. I don't ever expect to leave this country again, unfortunately. But fortunately, I love this country, and I think it's got lovely places to go to. It's not sunny enough. I remember in the Christmas of, when was it? I think it was under the first lockdown, I went off to Wales, and it was beautiful sunshine. All my friends were sending pictures from rainy Spain. It was lovely. If anyone gives you a fixed penalty notice, don't pay it, challenge it. Because the basis to it is not legal. Get yourself a good lawyer. I've got lots of them. I can put you in contact with them. Never pay with them. Know the limits of law enforcement. The time to not know UK law is over. Yeah, almost all of this is being done illegally. We need to educate ourselves. And I'll tell you what, I do know the law. And when you talk to police or anyone else who's trying to arrest you or to get you to do something and you talk about the law, they go away because they don't know the law. It's not an option anymore. You've got to know what the law is. Yeah, well, I have written a lot about the laws of this, yeah. Know your employment rights. If you are in a position where your employer is saying you need to wear a mask or you need to get injected, again, they are doing it outside of any legal basis. Say to them very basic things like, well, have you done a risk assessment on this? Because since wearing a mask could damage my health, what's your risk assessment of this? And they'll say, oh, well, we know that masks are good for you. And you go, really? I can produce 20, 30, 50 reports by some of the most eminent physicians in the world saying they're dangerous for my health. So challenge your employer if they do that. Obvious one, particularly when buying my book, use cash whenever you can. If a school is trying to inject your child or regender your child or put your child under unreversible medical interventions, withhold your consent. Yeah? And you make it damn clear to your school that they do not have the right to inject your child or do anything else behind their back. Defend the privacy of your home. Yeah? So many people under lockdown were opening their doors to policemen who were breaking in, again, outside of the rights. They never had the legal right in this country. They did under regulations in Wales. They never did in this country to break down your door and come in and find out whether you were socially distancing. I know that because I definitely wasn't socially distancing under lockdown, and I knew my rights, and I would never open my door. And whenever you can publicly demonstrate your rights and freedoms. Yeah? Courage, what's that famous phrase? Courage draws courage to itself. If you've got a chance to state this and behave in such a way, please do so. Okay, so that's individual things you can do. Civil disobedience is more about collective actions. So, demonstrations and protests, go on them. The least they can do is give you a support network of yourself. When in those wonderful demonstrations over the spring and summer of this year, they were ignored in Parliament, they were censored in the press, the government never talked about them except to describe us as right-wing conspiracy theorists. But if you went on them, you know what it did for those of us who were on it. I was walking along the street and met people who were divided from each other, from their wives or their husbands or their children because of their stance, and they were still there, and they found support in doing so. So demonstrations are not merely about getting into the papers or in the media. It's about looking after each other. Always go to meetings like this and talk to each other. Organise ourselves. We need to get organised. When I look at what's going on in China at the moment, which is truly terrifying, there's nothing to stop that happening here. And we need to organise ourselves to oppose it. I believe in unionisation. We've seen what the unions are doing at the moment. Isn't it a shame they didn't come out and do that when they were defending the restrictions put on the workers on masking and vaccination? Unions can still work.
Union did.
Sorry?
Workers of England Union did.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Yeah. Set up mutually supporting networks like this. Educate people. There is so much lies. Don't assume that because we know what's going on, that everyone else goes on. If you read the Telegraph and the Guardian and the Times and the Financial Times and the Daily Mail and whatever, you haven't got a clue what is going on. Always educate people if you've got a chance to do so. Yeah. Counter-propaganda. Yeah. We need to start, as part of that education thing, we need to start our own propaganda campaigns when we can, and that's a collective activity. Someone came to me the other day and said, very soon they're going to shut down social media. It's all going to be done. When the online safety bill goes through, social media is kind of over, because they're basically Twitter and all that lot will just simply ban anything that we say at all, again on the justification of the common good. So he wants to set up a campaign of leafleting, and he wants to get as many people as he can to pledge. It's called, what's it called? I can't come back to later. To pledge to actually become part of a leafleting campaign, and you give it to 10 people, you give it to 10 people, you give it to 10 people, and you create this kind of network of communication. I think at some point we're going to have to set up an independent economy. I'm meeting with someone in the new year to talk about Bitcoin, about which I understand absolutely nothing, because I'm not an economist and I don't understand that. But I think we should...
Cash leafleting, you mentioned somebody was doing leafleting to do with cash.
Yeah.
Who was it? Who was it you were talking about?
I'll look it up in a minute. So it's not my bad. Yeah. Loads of people are sort of doing that. Yeah. There's no one way to do this. There's lots of different ways to do that. There's a plurality of it as well. I think thinking that there's one group in control, or one party or one political party, is what's got us into this mess in the first place, thinking there's some sort of single authority. I think at some point we're going to have to talk about collective food production as well. Off-grid energy production. And given what's happening in China, this is the real dark end of things, I think. What's happening in China at the moment, we might have to think about creating militias to defend ourselves against when the hazmat-suited police come in and start dragging us off to quarantine camps. Yes, it is very encouraging to see so. Yeah. I mean, people being burnt in those towers. Last thing, very quickly, because I think someone wanted me to talk about this. More and more people are asking the question, what can we do about this? I've given some sort of little detailed things. The big answer is we need to overthrow this system of politics. We need to overthrow this system of economics, and we have to create a new politics and new economics. But that's a very big answer. And if you say that to most people, they'll say, that means I can't do anything at all. You need smaller answers, smaller responses. I think one of the answers is the revival of the politics of friendship. There's a presentation given by Hannah Arendt in the 1950s called Humanity in Dark Times. And she talked about, it came into a book, she put it together into a book called Men in Dark Times, in which she wanted to look at figures in history who lived through dark times. And the preeminent one for her was the period of the Third Reich and the Second World War. And she wanted to see how people got through those dark times and what that can tell us about when we face dark times. Because Hannah Arendt was absolutely certain that totalitarianism would return, and she was absolutely right. It has returned, and we're back in dark times, which are very similar to that. And she talked about friendship, which I thought that's an interesting idea. She said friendship for the ancient Greeks was not what it is for us. Friendship for us is a space of intimacy in which we meet up and we escape our alienation from the world by exchanging the details of our private lives. She said for the ancient Greeks it was quite different to that. She said the city-state, the polis, the state, the democratic state, on which the ancient Greeks based their society, was contingent upon friendship. Friendship for the ancient Greeks wasn't a space of intimacy, it was a space in which people met and discussed the world with each other. So quite different from an intimate space. They met up and talked about the world. It struck me, as I'm sure it struck you, that friendship, in this broader sense of the term, was specifically targeted by the state under lockdown. And it is still being targeted now. One of the reasons I'm really glad to turn up here today is because I can see you in the flesh. We're encouraged to do everything online at the moment, aren't we? Everything's a Zoom. I never used Zoom before this, and now almost everything I do is on Zoom, unless I can help it. It not only targeted us, it said, we want you to stay at home. Some people stayed at home for almost 2 years, didn't they? A year and a half or something. Some are still at home. They wanted to cover our faces up with a mask. They want us to work from home. They wanted us not to have interpersonal relationships, but to do everything via these machines, which of course eventually they're going to take over. And they're going to, my partner's a lecturer, and they're trying to put all teaching online now. And that means they're going to be able to control exactly what gets taught to our kids as well. But it also targeted relationships as well. As I said, when I was on the... I've lost many friends over this, very dear friends, intelligent friends, friends I know for many, many years, who knew that we went to Iraq war on fabricated dossiers and stuff like that, but suddenly chose to believe everything the pharmaceutical companies and so on and so forth. They have targeted our friendships, our common humanity with each other, the community that we form with each other. And I think it's because of that it shows that the politics of friendship, not simply an intimate space, a space in which we talk about the world, does have a force, does have a power. There is a politics to friendship. The final thing that it actually targeted was not only our interpersonal relationships, but it banned us from talking about this brave new world that they're pushing us into. They haven't asked us whether we want central bank digital currency or digital ID. They haven't asked us whether we want to be ruled by a single global government. They haven't asked us whether we want to run our freedom of speech via Facebook and the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter and so on. They haven't asked us any of this. They've simply decided that. So my answer, if you like, one of the answers to what we can do about this is to reclaim the politics of friendship. And that kind of means, in a way, doing all those other individual things that we talked about. Because that's how we recreate the politics of friendship. And out of that, maybe a new politics. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.